This is Yorkshire Television. It's 10 o'clock now, and time for the World News from ITN.
White hot and molten, 163 are feared dead. Those who escaped were winched from the blazing water. This survivor said it was fry or jump, so he jumped. The child abuse doctors are sued for damages by parents. In Iran, a mass funeral turns into a Death to America rally. Good evening. The explosions that destroyed a North Sea oil platform last night, killing 163, are now thought to have been caused by a gas leak. Occidental Oil, the owners, say the gas probably exploded immediately below the living quarters, where most of the victims were sleeping. The search for survivors was called off 15 minutes ago. Occidental say 232 men were on the platform at the time. 16 bodies have been recovered. 147 are still missing. 69 men survived, many suffering terrible burns as they jumped into the burning sea. One said tonight, it was fry or jump, so we jumped. The Piper Alpha platform is 120 miles east of Wick. The rescue operation was coordinated by the Aberdeen Coast Guard. Shortly after the explosion, a 17-mile exclusion zone was set up as more than 30 ships and up to 11 helicopters joined the search.
The Piper Alpha oil platform became an inferno within seconds. The cameraman who took these pictures was on the first rescue helicopter to reach the scene. The pilot expressed horror at what he could see.
Bloody hell, it's really on fire, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a big one. Jesus Christ.
The searing heat from the platform could be felt as the helicopter got closer. But at first, the full scale of the disaster wasn't realized.
The Piper platform explosion on the Piper platform, followed by fire. All personnel evacuated, over.
But as the rescue operation began, it soon became apparent that the evacuation of the platform hadn't been successful. By chance, the platform's support vessel, the Tharos, was near Piper Alpha. Its hoses poured water onto the flames, but with the platform now literally white hot, their effect was minimal. The explosion had split Piper Alpha from top to bottom. In all, 11 helicopters went to the scene. Joined by a flotilla of tugs and fishing vessels, they plucked survivors from the water.
Okay, there's another helicopter, Yankee Bravo, in the area, who's trying to spot people in the water. The rig is well alight, lots of black smoke.
Most had either jumped or had been blown into the sea by the force of the blast. Survivors were found up to 1.5 miles away from the burning platform. They were taken first to the supply vessel, where full medical facilities were available. A team of doctors had been flown out from Aberdeen to offer specialised care. Most victims were badly burnt. All were in deep shock. It's thought that the temperature of the water had been raised by the blaze, giving those who hadn't had time to don protective clothing a greater chance of survival. Once immediate care had been given, they started to talk about the explosions.
I don't know. Well, it was two main big ones, I think, but there was quite a few smaller ones.
Just a succession of small ones and then two big ones.
Yeah, there was a big one just before I got off. That was one of the biggest ones.
And you got burns to your hands. How did you sustain that? How did you get that?
That was crawling across the metal work to get to the edge of the rig. Everything was just quite hot.
The metal work was quite hot?
Yeah. Well, it's actually slippery because the soles of the boots was melting when you was trying to walk across the metal. You know?
More survivors were stretchered to the Tharos throughout the night. As the helicopters made more journeys, it became increasingly clear that many hadn't got off the platform. Those who had been asleep may never have heard the warning that something was wrong. As daylight broke, the full scale of the damage to the platform became clear. Ships continued to find survivors in the water hours after the initial blast. Winched to safety, they too were taken to the supply vessel. Treatment there was available throughout the day. The fire continued to burn. Twisted metal, now all that remains of what had been the offshore home of more than 200 men.
Those exclusive pictures were shot by cameraman Paul Berriff and soundman Mike Riley for Scottish Television for a series of ITV programmes on the rescue services at Lossiemouth. Survivors who jumped from the blazing platform helped others to get into the rescue boats. One man, a rigger, Mr. Derek Ellington, helped 34 of his fellow workers out of the sea. He told his story to Frank Gilfeather of Grampian Television, starting with when he heard the scream of escaping gas, but thought it was just other riggers fooling about.
I was screaming like a banshee, and I thought for a start it was some of the guys acting a goat, like a high-pitched scream. But if it was two gas leaks in the centreface. It happened simultaneously, and that was the noise that was happening. It was the gas escaping. And 30 seconds after, we had our first explosion. No, we couldn't go up, we couldn't get up. Only one way we could go, down. That's the only way. Now, there was a couple of guys who were screaming, let's get the GPA away, general purpose alarm. They couldn't get away because the control room was wiped out. By that time, the standby boat was on the ball. The Z boat was there. So it was me and another 4 guys went in, and she was ballooning them. They taken us to the standby boat, and then they started their business. But all the time after that, it was explosion, explosion, explosion after explosion. 2/3 of that platform, so it was a 6-legged platform. 2/3 of it melted with heat and disappeared under the water. I was bits blind here, I was bits blind all over the place. It was just bloody horrific, I can assure you.
Was any thought given by you or anybody else in your group that the water may be so cold that you might not survive?
Could you picture a sun coming out the atmosphere and coming down to the sea? If you took it down, the water wasn't calm. You had so much heat coming from that platform. If you had actually been, I would say maybe even as far as 1/4 mile, you've been immersed in that water with the heat. I was a guy jumped for the helideck at the highest level in that platform. He jumped for there. He didn't have any other option. He had a decision to make. It was toast or jump. He jumped. And most of the other guys jumped for the pipe deck. Other guy did a beautiful swallow dive just below that, 60 feet up, and they picked him up.
Approaching the scene of the disaster early this morning, a thick column of smoke was rising thousands of feet into the air above the blazing platform. The oil and gas escaping from the crippled rig was still burning fiercely. A 15-mile exclusion zone has been imposed around the site. Inside that zone, a string of ships combed the area looking for any survivors. The whole superstructure of the platform has collapsed in a tangle of molten metal. A rescue boat that got too close was engulfed in the flames. One survivor was picked out of the sea more than 1.5 miles away from the burning platform, but the chances of the rescue services finding anyone else alive are getting more remote with each hour that passes. If any men who jumped from the rig are still in the water, it's unlikely that they could survive such a long period of immersion.
I was on the 20-foot level and there was a massive explosion, great balls of flame. So I jumped into the sea because the rescue boat moved away, otherwise it would have been burnt with all the people.
From about 25 miles away, we could see the flames, and obviously as we got closer, appreciated the magnitude. The flames really were huge and quite remarkable.
What about the heat?
The heat, obviously,
It wasn't until we got a lot closer, but you could feel the heat quite clearly, in fact, uncomfortably clearly.
Basically, they had very little notice about it. The explosion happened, and they weren't able to launch any of their escape vessels or life rafts, and were committed really to escaping from a rig by simply leaping from some 200 feet into the water.
The rescue services, coordinated from this control room, have been working around the clock. But they now fear only bodies will be recovered from the water. The sheer scale of the disaster became apparent to them when the first helicopters carrying the injured began landing at Aberdeen's Royal Infirmary. Some were just suffering from shock and were able to walk from the helicopters. Others arrived on stretchers and were taken straight into intensive care. At first light, the fleet of helicopters was still bringing in the injured. The ordeal of the disaster had completely numbed them. The worst cases were the burn victims caught in the intense heat of the explosion. The anguish of the relatives crowded into the hospital was clear as they waited desperately for news of those posted as missing. Nurses battled throughout the day to bring relief to the survivors, most of them suffering from horrific burns. 11 of the most seriously injured will undergo skin graft operations in the next 24 hours. Some of the patients, though, were well enough to be able to talk about their experiences on the platform.
Within about 5 minutes, you know, the inferno and the smoke was so much that the people, they tried all the exit doors from the accommodation to get out onto the rig and get into the water or the boats or whatever. But, you know, they were beaten back at every opportunity. You know, so eventually myself, about a dozen guys, tried a place that we got out that had previously been blocked. You know, we smoked. Decision was made for me. It was roasting. You know, it was fry or jump, so it was jump.
A specialist team of plastic surgeons was flown in. They worked with the victims of the Bradford fire and know the problems ahead.
If the grafts take, they'll at least be healed within 2 weeks. They will then have many months of rehabilitation. The problem with burns is it's a slowly evolving situation, and the psychological problems come later, I think.
Distraught relatives and friends left the hospital when it became clear that no more survivors were being brought in. The last man taken alive from the scene arrived here just before 9 o'clock this morning. They went home to share their grief in private. Tonight, more than 24 hours after the first explosions ripped through the Piper Alpha platform, the fierce flames have been damped down. The melancholy search for the bodies is still going on, and a pall of black smoke still hangs over the platform, marking the site of the world's worst ever oil-filled disaster. David Chater, News at 10 in the North Sea.
Occidental said tonight it thought leaking gas was the cause of the explosion which tore the platform apart. The fatal leak may have been under the living quarters, a report in part 2. Also, 2 are found guilty of laundering the proceeds of Britain's biggest bullion robbery, and the Russians hope to reach Mars in the new year. That's in a couple of minutes.
As the investigation into the Piper Alpha explosion got underway, the government announced a far-reaching public inquiry. And tonight experts were predicting it could cost insurance companies £500 million in compensation payments.
On Piper Alpha, one of the oldest platforms in the North Sea, half the crew would have been off duty last night, asleep or resting in their quarters. From the time of the first explosion, they had only seconds to escape along these corridors, the exits often blocked by smoke. Survivors report the sound of escaping gas, and at a press conference, Occidental said they thought a gas leak probably caused the disaster.
It would appear that the first explosion occurred due to an escape of gas in the C module. A series of explosions and fires quickly followed.
Oil from 36 wells was collected and brought up pipes onto the Alpha platform. The oil passed through the wellhead to a second unit where oil and gas were separated. The gas was then compressed in a unit called Module C. From there, it was piped away. There was a fire 4 years ago in Module B, but Occidental say that wasn't operating last night, and Module C was the scene of the explosion. Oil platforms are inspected annually without warning. part of the safety training that includes regular emergency drills. Government inspectors completed a survey of Piper Alpha last month.
There were one or two minor faults, but nothing that was in any way suggested that there was any sort of trouble on the way, just routine faults which were reported on and will be put right.
What sort of faults were those?
I think there was some talk about corrosion of certain pipes and so on. I haven't actually seen the detailed report yet. I've been too busy today to look at it. But the point I'm making is that there is a regular process of inspection.
Corrosion is a common problem in the North Sea and may have played no part in last night's disaster. What is certain is that there was no time to use the escape routes. No one escaped on the 6 lifeboats. The heli-deck was also out of use as men tried desperately to get out of the living quarters. The safety boat, which is on permanent standby, did rescue survivors who jumped into the sea. Investigators are bound to look at alternative escape systems, like these free-fall lifeboats. Norwegian oil workers have to go through 2 days training before moving on to the 2 platforms which have free-fall lifeboats installed. It's not yet clear whether they would have helped. In the next few days, Occidental will be faced with one big problem, capping the 6 oil wells still leaking under the wreck of Piper Alpha.
The Queen has sent a message of condolence to those involved in the tragedy. She said, "I was shocked to hear of the dreadful disaster. My heartfelt sympathy goes out to the injured and bereaved." In the Commons, the Prime Minister praised the emergency services. She said they had absolutely excelled themselves. The Piper Alpha disaster takes the number of dead in the gas and oil fields of the North Sea to more than 400.
This morning, the reaction in the Cabinet, as in the country, was one of dismay and shock, expressed first by the Energy Secretary.
Well, the whole Cabinet is shocked and very saddened by this. It's a very large number of possible fatalities, and a lot of families are going to be affected.
And when the Commons gathered in the afternoon, the front benches were united in their reaction.
The rescue services, always good, had on this occasion absolutely excelled themselves. I would all be very grateful to them for that, although we know the enormous tragedy with which they were faced.
May I fully endorse the Prime Minister's sympathy for those who have lost loved ones and those who have been injured in the horrific accident in the North Sea oil field.
But already the hard questioning is beginning. Labour claims safety standards are declining.
Oh, yes. The trade unions have been complaining for some time about the increasing amount of incidents and dangerous occurrence, which are confirmed in the government's own figures. And indeed, the House of Commons Select Committee looked at the reduction in safety and maintenance that was going on the rigs and expressed extreme concern. So there's quite a lot of evidence.
Mr. Parkinson denies that, but promises an investigation which is far-reaching and public.
The first priority for the government and for the opposition parties is to discover the cause of this tragedy so that the 30,000 people who work in the UK sector of the North Sea can be sure it won't happen again. Peter Allen, News at 10, Westminster.
The North Sea may look sparsely populated, but 50,000 people work here, a community about the size of Corby in Northamptonshire. After 15 years of North Sea oil production, Britain operates 50 fields with more than 120 platforms linked to the mainland with a network of pipes. The rewards have always been high, but so have the risks. On the Norwegian Ekofisk Bravo rig 11 years ago, a blowout caused a huge oil slick. In 1980, the Alexander Keelan, a floating hotel, capsized in a force 10 gale, killing 123. Until today, that was the North Sea's biggest disaster, but there have been deaths every year. In 1965, 16 men died in 2 accidents off Teesport and the Humber. In 1983, 7 died and 18 were injured in fires, explosions and a diving bell accident. The following year, 3 rig workers burnt to death. And in 1985, fires and explosions killed another 8. In February, 2 men died in a crane collapse. More than 60 others have died in helicopters, taking them to and from the rigs. North Sea oil platforms are effectively sealed communities, combining the facilities of factory, hotel and power station for up to 300 people. But the Piper Alpha platform was more than that. It was also a junction for 5 other oil fields, piping about 12% of Britain's oil ashore at Flotter. All are now shut. The loss of production will cost £2.5 million a day. City experts believe the disaster will also hit the balance of payments, and it's thought it could be well over a year before the Piper Alpha field works again.
And now the rest of the news. One man has been killed and 5 other people injured by a bomb in West Belfast tonight. It went off next to the swimming baths in the Falls Road, close to a joint police and army post. It's thought the bomb was triggered by a command wire as a patrol was returning. Some of the police and troops were treated for shock. The area has now been sealed off whilst an investigation is carried out. No one has yet claimed responsibility. The injured included a 4-year-old girl and a 60-year-old woman.
A couple whose 3 children were taken from them during the Cleveland child abuse controversy have issued writs for damages against the 2 doctors involved, Marietta Higgs and Jeffrey Wyatt. Tonight, the Northern Regional Health Authority said it has set up a team to consider the 2 doctors' positions in the light of yesterday's report from Lord Butler Sloss.
Lawyer David Scorfield this afternoon put the finishing touches to the writs which accused doctors Higgs and Wyatt and Cleveland County Council of negligence. The parents he represents had their 3 children put into care after the 2 doctors diagnosed sexual abuse. The courts returned the children home. Now they're a test case. The writs were rubber-stamped by the High Court in Middlesbrough and seek exemplary damages.
It is a substantial amount that the parents will be seeking to compensate them for the great anguish and pain and suffering caused to them by the doctors and the local authority.
Paperwork and legal procedures mean it'll be many months before the case is actually heard before the High Court. The child sex abuse controversy in Cleveland is far from over. Simon Cole, News at 10 in Middlesbrough.
A London solicitor has been found guilty of helping to launder £26 million from the Brinks Mat gold bullion robbery. Michael Relton was jailed for 12 years at the Old Bailey today. He was described as the paymaster general of the conspiracy. Kathleen McAvoy, who's married to one of the robbers, was given an 18-month suspended sentence for 2 years. 2 other defendants were acquitted today, and 2 others face a retrial after the jury failed to reach a verdict.
Zurich, financial capital of Switzerland, also the centre of one of the largest money laundering operations ever uncovered by British police. It was here in a luxury hotel above the city that a team of Britons planned on ways of spending around £7 million, part of the proceeds of the Brinks Mat robbery. Among them, Michael Relton, a London solicitor whose greed had lured him from one side of the law to the other. The cash came from the Brinks Mat gold, resmelted and sold back onto the open market. Much of it was flown or driven to Switzerland, where Relton and the team were waiting. It went first to the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank in Todesstrasse. In all, over £2,800,000 was paid in here. Then, 70 miles away, to Vaduz in Liechtenstein. Under the shadow of the great castle, the team opened a string of accounts in this bank, moving over £3 million from one account to another. By now, the team believed they were safe. They assumed it would be impossible for anyone to trace the origins of their money back through the maze of bank accounts set up here in Switzerland, so it was time to start spending it. The money started flowing back into Britain, first to the London Docklands, where the team bought the New Caledonian Wharf for £750,000 before selling it on at a huge profit. Then luxury homes in the country. When detectives arrived at Mrs. Kathleen McAvoy's new £250,000 farmhouse in Kent, they were greeted by 2 Rottweiler guard dogs, one called Brinks, the other Matt.
In Lebanon, a group holding American hostages said that their fate will be part of the retaliation against the United States for shooting down the Iranian Airbus.
Iranian mourners converged on Tehran for the mass funerals. It was a particularly painful journey for these people, flying Iran Air over the Gulf. They appeared saddened and subdued by the thought of those 290 people blown out of the sky by the American missile. The flight crew were quiet with their thoughts as they flew directly over the crash site, checking and double-checking the same flight path along which the ill-fated Airbus was assigned. A refrigerated warehouse at Bandar Abbas was used as a makeshift morgue, but the task of identification has been virtually impossible. This man's burden was heavy, searching for the bodies of 5 of his relatives. If the Iranians are to counter the American version of events as false, they must find the flight recorders.
It was the first time the people of Iran have been officially called onto the streets to protest at the shooting down of the Airbus. They gathered in their tens of thousands outside the Parliament building, where the bodies of almost 70 of the victims had been brought to be honoured prior to their burial. Relatives of the dead were allowed through, some expressing their anger, others, like this pilot whose wife was killed, simply overcome with emotion. From the platform, Iran's President Khamenei attacked America and Iraq for conspiring to plot the attack. Speaker Rafsanjani, who has appeared to be advising no retaliation that would allow America off the hook of worldwide condemnation, did not speak.
Today, the speeches reverted to a familiar theme: America and President Reagan condemned as the great Satan, and revenge promised for the deaths of the Airbus passengers.
As the coffins were carried away, some were almost dropped in the crush. The procession moved slowly through the city, the mourners chanting anti-American slogans before the victims were finally laid to rest. Paul Davis, News at 10, Tehran.
A Russian spacecraft lifted off today at the start of a 200-day journey to the planet Mars. The giant Proton rocket, carrying instruments from 13 different countries, heads first for the Martian moon Phobos. 2 probes will be dropped onto the surface of the moon to transmit data back to Earth. It then flies on to the planet Mars itself to begin a 3-month study in preparation for a manned flight early in the next century. The Russians hope the Americans will finally join them in putting the first man on Mars. Cricket. England have called off their planned tour of Sri Lanka in November. The Test and County Cricket Board said they were cancelling the trip because of continued fighting on the island. In the NatWest Trophy, Chris Smith, 99 not out, sees Hampshire home against Somerset. John Derrick, 4 for 57, as Glamorgan beat Lancashire by 31 runs. Jack Richards, 30 not out, as Surrey struggled to put out Essex. Tim Curtis, 120, and Graham Hick, 105, as Worcestershire pile on the runs against Notts, who'll get their chance tomorrow. And we've just received this report from David Chater on the oil rig disaster. He's in Aberdeen.
The fire on board the Piper Alpha platform has broken out again. These pictures were taken at the scene of the disaster just 2 hours ago. Half of the platform has been completely destroyed by the explosion. Air-sea rescue helicopters are still inside the exclusion zone, but there's now little hope of finding any survivors. The task is now one of finding bodies. A fleet of NATO ships is still on station, but the operation is expected to be scaled down tomorrow. The water around the rig is littered with wreckage. The tattered remains of the personal effects of the people on board the rig have been carefully collected. A team of investigators is expected to be flown out to the scene tomorrow. David Chater, News at 10 in the North Sea.
For anyone who wants more information, there's a telephone number. It's 0224 649 666. 0224 649 666. And that's all the news from us tonight. We'll be back tomorrow. Good night.
Good evening. On Humberside, an investigation is underway tonight into how a child died during a school trip to Goole Docks. 7-year-old Clive Baker of Moorland Road in Old Goole was with a party of children from Old Goole First School. He was struck by a piece of metal and wood sculpture that toppled over in a quayside shed. The shed is being used as a studio for an art exhibition. Clive was dead on arrival at hospital. A whole man is missing, feared dead after the Piper Alpha oil rig disaster in the North Sea. His name hasn't been released yet. Another 2 men from Hull were among the 67 survivors of the tragedy. They're 47-year-old Mike Bradley and Harold Miller, both from Bransholme. They're both being treated for burns in hospital in Aberdeen. Mr. Miller's condition was described as serious tonight. Among the doctors helping the victims are 2 specialists from this region, Mr. Gerald Layton from Pinderfields Hospital, Wakefield, and Dr. David Sharp, head of Bradford's Plastic Surgery and Burns Unit. Firemen are still battling to control flooding, which forced a dozen families out of their homes at Slathwaite near Huddersfield this evening. Torrential afternoon rain swelled the River Colne nearby, and the floodings thought to have been caused when a culvert burst. Houses in New Street and Spa Mill Terrace soon had water up to first floor level. 15 people, including a pregnant woman, had to be rescued from upstairs windows. Pumping work's been hampered by a fractured gas main, and damage is estimated at tens of thousands of pounds. And at Curtin in Lindsay near Scunthorpe tonight, the gable end of a house exploded when it was struck by lightning. A gaping hole was left in the side of the house in Ings Road, and debris caused serious damage to cars parked nearby. No one was injured. West Yorkshire Police are hunting an armed raider who got away with cash from a building society office in Kippax near Leeds this afternoon. The man went into the Leeds and Holbeck branch in High Street and threatened staff with a handgun. He was given an undisclosed amount of cash and made off on foot towards Cross Hills. No shots were fired and no one was injured. Bomb disposal experts have detonated a £100 World War I shell in Sheffield. Roads were closed and nearby residents were warned to take precautions. Peter McNerney reports.
The shell was discovered at an open cast coal site at Aldgreave in Sheffield. Army experts have been called in to search the area after several other wartime shells were found. Today's controlled blast went off without a hitch. The shell wasn't live, it was filled with sand for training purposes. It's not known how it got there. The work of the bomb disposal team continues. More shells, possibly live, could still be buried at the site.
And finally, a familiar figure in Parliament has died. Ted, the guide dog for Sheffield MP David Blunkett, had been ill for some time. The retriever and Labrador crossbreed had been with Mr Blunkett for 10 years and was the first dog allowed into the Commons chamber. And that's all the news for tonight. Join us for our first headlines at 9:25 in the morning. And now here's Redbus Carr with the region's weather prospects.
It'll be mostly dry with clear periods overnight, but showers will continue to affect Pennine areas at times. The lowest temperature 10 centigrade 50 Fahrenheit, with southwesterly winds gradually decreasing. Tomorrow morning may start dry and bright in the east of the region, but showers will spread to most parts by midday. The showers may be heavy in a few places in the afternoon, with patchy fog forming over high ground. It'll be another rather cool day, with the highest temperature 17 degrees centigrade 63 Fahrenheit, and winds moderate from the southwest. That's the forecast.